I'm going to show you my version of what works for me doing a hinge, okay? It's the kind of thing you can read about doing hinges in every single jewelry techniques book. I teach a workshop in hinge and catch making, and by the end, everybody goes home with a hinge, having tried a hinge. And the reason for that is because then you realize it's not as difficult as it might seem, okay? A lot of things, it's easier to see somebody do it than to just read it out of a book, because in theory, oh yeah, that should work. But actually trying it can be a different story. A great hinge book that I just picked up from Charles Luton Brain is this book. I'm going to pass this around. You guys can thumb through it. And he is going to be one of the speakers at the conference. I'm more than sure this book will be available for people. I also have a big stack of handouts I'm going to give you toward the end. But I'm going to go ahead and pass this around. There are some great ideas. If anybody that hasn't read this book, it's really great. If you're trying to think of anything that you can do using a hinge, it's in here. So I'm going to go ahead and, hey Paul, you want to start passing that around? You guys can kind of look through that as I'm talking and demonstrating. I think the video looks better if we don't have lights on, so I think it'll be okay. As we're going along, if you're not seeing what I'm doing on the screen, just speak up, okay?
I can take the abuse.
What?
They can yell at me.
They can yell at Ron. Yeah, yell at Ron. So, why don't I talk a little bit about a hinge. Then what I'm also going to do is all the stuff I have up here, I'm just going to throw some ideas at you about making jewelry that actually has movable parts. Okay? And these are just some ideas to get your brain thinking about, not everything has to be something that doesn't move. Okay? And the way I've worked ever since I was an undergraduate in school is I always wanted things to move, and I was always trying to think of different ways that I could get my jewelry to move without it just being a jump ring. Okay? So why don't I get started? I'll sort of talk about the different parts of the hinge. Let me see where I'm at. Okay. I have a couple of hinges here. Oh, my one yesterday, by the way, didn't work, so it wasn't a disaster. So I just thought I'd point that out to you. I'm going to do an easier one today. Some of the things about a hinge that you really want to function is, okay, you've got your piece of metal that your two pieces that you're joining together, okay, and then all of the segmented pieces, they're called knuckles, okay. So when I talk about knuckles, it's the sections of a hinge, okay? And by the way, if you have any questions along the way, just interrupt and blurt out a question, okay? Because it's probably something that somebody sitting next to you is thinking as well. So I love questions, because I sometimes forget things. So in order to have your hinge function well, all of your knuckles need to be lined up straight, okay? I do a lot of drawing, so Ron, you'll have to follow me, okay? If I'm doing a hinge and I've got my knuckles, my drawings are terrible, but you get the idea. You don't want to have knuckles that start going off in different directions, okay? Because you know what? It won't open. Okay, so it really isn't a hinge if it doesn't open. So one of the keys is to have all of your knuckles straight, okay? Now, the other thing that makes a hinge function well is you have to have an odd number of knuckles, okay? And the reason for that is your hinge has better support if the two end pieces are on the same side. Do you know what I mean? If I have a hinge that has 3 knuckles, I've got my 2 end ones on one side and my single one on the other, okay? That way, if you have 2 and 2, if I did a hinge with 4, I would get way too much play in this, and eventually my hinge would loosen, or well, it would loosen, and you wouldn't have a nice tight hinge any longer. So you really do have to have an odd number. You get that support on the ends. And I personally feel that it's a fact, a hinge that has 5 knuckles is preferred over 3 knuckles, because again, in strength, you have this one side that only has 1 knuckle, and that piece needs a little bit more support than just 1. So yesterday I tried to do 5 knuckles. One of my knuckles didn't solder down, but it wasn't a disaster. So today I'm going to make it easier on myself, and I'm going to make a hinge with 3 knuckles, okay? And actually I could do 5. I could do 5. I kind of want to show the harder thing that could possibly happen, because that's the one thing is 5 knuckles is harder to do than 3, okay? I'm sorry, what? Oh, okay. So, only because the more knuckles you have, the more that can go wrong, okay? So, maybe I'll do 5. Let's see. I'm kind of bummed by one yesterday. I had 1 knuckle that didn't solder down. So let me show you some things that don't function well. Besides your knuckles need to be lined up. Another thing that you really want, see, I have a hinge here. Can you see this, Ron? I have a hinge here, and see my knuckles are not straight. So I never put it together because I knew it wouldn't function well. So that's one thing you want. Straight knuckles, okay. This one has straight knuckles. Oh, this is a good one, okay. This one has straight knuckles. And then what also happens is the back of this lines up, okay? And what I'm talking about is I don't have a separation here that is not even, okay? Because this one here, as you can see, if I'm going too fast, just let me know. It's like a short period of time to do this, so it's like a marathon. If you look at this one, my sheet is touching at the bottom, okay? But I've got a separation here at the top. So if that happens, when I go to open my hinge will function as a hinge, but if this were, say, a top of a box, my lid would, when I open it up, go off to an angle, okay? Depends on how picky you are, I guess. But you really want it to line up. Okay, so you don't want a little gap in the back there. Let's see, another thing that you don't want to have, because it will weaken your hinge, is too much play. See how that moves? My middle knuckle can move quite easily there, and what will happen is over time this will wear away. Okay, so where was my one that worked? This one has a tiny, tiny bit of play, but not enough to worry about. It's all straight. I've got my knuckles are straight, so this is a preferred hinge. Okay. Question.
The handouts that you have, do they cover a lot of what you're saying? So
They do.
Do we need to be writing everything down, or are the handouts going to?
You might want to, because a lot of the handouts are just pictures.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's a good question. Now, it's something that you would use a hinge on. Here's a piece that's a similar hinge to what I'm going to be demonstrating. This piece here, as I unscrew this, my little dump truck spoon here, it pivots on a hinge right in this area here. So this will move up and down, okay? Another thing you can use a hinge on is obviously bracelets. Real popular item. Here I pulled out an old piece that I'll never part with, because it's the piece I learned how to solder on when I was a junior in college. Bracelet, where it, opens on a hinge, okay. Boxes, obviously. If I were doing a box, it is easier to do a box with a hinge that, let me see if I can draw my little box here. The kind of hinge that I'm going to show. I'm just showing you the basic hinge here. I would make a cube and cut off the top and put my hinge on the side here. Okay? So the kind of hinge that I'm going to show you today is the kind of hinge I would put on a box like that. Okay? Now keep in mind, and this book shows it, there are dozens of different scenarios for using a hinge, different types of hinges. I'm just going to show you the basic thing to give you an idea of how easy it is to make a hinge. I often talk about in my workshops people will suddenly not design something with a hinge because they're afraid to do it. So that's why I make everybody do one in my workshop. First, any questions so far? No? Okay. First thing that you need is, when creating a hinge, you need a nice little seat. I'm going to be drawing a picture of a sheet on edge. I'm going to be doing a hinge, I think it's 20 gauge sheet that I'm using. So this is my two 20 gauge pieces of sheet butt up next to each other. I need to create a nice little seat for my hinge to sit in, okay? So I am going to go ahead and, I'm still deciding whether I'm going to do 3 knuckles or 5. So I'm going to go ahead and file on the edge of my sheet a 45-degree bevel, okay? So I have a nice seat for my knuckles to sit in. Because if you don't have a nice seat for them to sit in, you run the risk of having little knuckles like going all over the place when you go to solder this down, okay? Now, let me just do one more. I'm sorry, Ron.
I'm having fun.
Okay. Just as long as you're having fun. If I were doing a hinge where I was going to solder it on the very edge of 2 sheets, I would go ahead and file that bevel, but I'd probably go back in with a untapered round file, the size of the tubing that you're using for your knuckles, and I would go ahead and file that so I created a perfect little round seat for those knuckles to sit in, okay? And you can, the reason for an untapered one is you want it to be completely even all the way through. If you have a taper, it tends to throw it off a little bit, so by using one that doesn't have a taper, you're filing and you're not having your groove do different things. You're just filing straight across. So that is something. Now this sheet that I'm using is actually too small to use a file like that. It's not worth that, okay? Okay. So let me go ahead. I'm gonna do 3 knuckles. I'm gonna go ahead and file a 45-degree bevel, and I'm using, what am I using? Probably a number 4 cut file. I'm taking most of my material off now, and I'm being very careful to not file. I'm just taking off the top corner. I don't want to really ruin my straight edge that I've started with. Okay, so I'm not touching the bottom edge of my sheet. And you really want this to be nice and even, okay? Whoops.
Oh, we can delete that.
Delete that? No, you can keep it all in, I don't care. This is my bench pen I brought from home. I always keep a real straight edge that I use a lot, and then I sort of like my triangle to be cut off to a side because I the next tool I'm going to show you fits in there perfectly. So I showed up here, there was a different bench pin. I couldn't use it. It looked too weird. So once I get most of the material off, to make sure I have a nice smooth surface, let me hold this up here, make sure it's even. I don't want filing off more at one end and not as much in the middle. I really want it to be an even parallel channel that my knuckle is sitting in, okay? Looks pretty good. So it's a little rough. I'm just going to take some 400 sandpaper and carefully just sand that so it's smooth, okay? Looks pretty good. Just because I hate working with something that's rough. I mean, you're never going to see this little channel, but I just, there's something about working with a rough surface. Okay. That looks pretty good. Can you guys see that? I might have a tiny bit of flare on the end, but for the most part, it's pretty good. Now, what I don't want is I really want my knuckles to sit in there nice, so what I don't want, and I might have to do a little fixing there, I might have a little bit of this. I don't want this to be like this. I don't want it to be curved. I really want it to be flat, so it's really sitting in there. If it's curved, I have less of a surface that my knuckle is hitting, and it also ends up sitting up higher. And you also run the risk of your little knuckles moving on you if it's sitting on this rounded surface. So you really want it to sit in, okay? And so I think I have a little bit of a rounded. That's not too bad, actually.
Do you ever use the filing jig?
A filing
The
jig.
hardened filing jig?
No. Why?
No, it guarantees you a perfect 45-degree angle.
Yeah. You know what? I'm also somebody, I like to do everything by hand. I have better control over things. Maybe I'm just wanting to control everything. I don't know. But I actually don't like even to use a flex shaft a whole lot because things happen faster than I really want them to. So I'm not a fan of the flex shaft. I do use it for certain things. But okay. So I've got my little seat. So we're ready to go. Now what I'm going to do is talk about knuckles, okay? What I've bought here, just so happens everything fits perfectly too. I have bought, can you guys see this? Thick-walled tubing, okay, for strength. Your hinge will be stronger if you use thick-walled tubing. Where I get my thick-walled tubing is a place locally called TSI. You can get thick-walled tubing through Rio Grande and Hauser and Miller. Probably other places too, but that's just where I've gotten it. So my diameter of my tubing here is 2 millimeters, okay? And my walls, I'm sorry, 2 millimeters, yeah.
The exterior?
The exterior, yeah. So can you see how thick the walls are on that tubing?
Let me bring it.
No? Because I can pass a little piece around once I get done cutting. You guys can see it. Can you see that?
Almost.
Marcia, what is the thickness of the wall, you know?
Do you know, I'm not sure, but
The whole size is what?
the whole size is it's about 16 gauge.
Okay, that helps.
Yeah.
Do you want to pass me?
Let me cut a piece off first and then I can pass
I think
it
it's
around.
like a half a millimeter.
I think it is, yeah, about 1/2 millimeter is the inside diameter. So, cutting your knuckles, okay? It is not a rule that all your knuckles have to be the same size. Now, the only reason why I would make the knuckles different sizes is for a certain look that I'm trying to achieve, okay? Otherwise, really, your hinge functions better if all your knuckles are the same size, okay? Now, I've gone ahead and I did this beforehand. I measured the distance that I'm going to be putting my knuckles on. I want it to go the whole distance, so measure that and then divided it by the number of knuckles that you're going to use, okay? So I've divided that by 3. And I'm going to cut my knuckles with a tubing jig. Now, if you guys don't know about these, it's a great tool. I use it all the time. And what are they, Joyce? They're what, about $45 with tax and everything? We have a group order going in on one with one of my classes.
Do you compensate for your saw?
No. Well, I might. I actually tend to measure this a tiny bit longer than what I want it to be, just because it's okay if your hinges, it's easier if your hinges hang over your sheet a little bit than to have them in a little. It's easier to file that off than to go and cut your sheet smaller and have this, you know, the size that you don't want. So you want your, if you can't get it perfect, it's better to have the knuckles hanging over and then just file off the little extra, okay? Now, the reason for using the tubing jig is, and let me show you how this works. I'm going to be cutting, my blade is going to go right into this slot right here, okay? So when I've measured my distance, I've measured it from about the center of this slot to this plate right here, okay? And what I'm going to do is I just put my tubing right in here, right, push it up against the plate. Can you guys see that? Mm-hmm. And then I can just hold my tubing in there with this little lever here, okay? And I've got my bench pin set up so it sits in here real nice. So now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cut right in this little slot here. I'm using I think probably a 2/0 saw blade. It's just what I use for everything. And then you have to make sure your piece doesn't go flying all over the place. I usually have a towel sitting in my lap. Oh, there it is, it fell. Now the advantage to using this tool is now that I've cut, I have a perfect 90-degree angle on the edge of my tubing, okay? And I don't have to do much to it. If you hand cut your knuckles and you do not have a 45-degree angle on the edge of your hinge, it will not open, okay? So I'm going to go ahead, I've already cut a bunch. I'll cut a couple extra so I can pass them around, so you guys can see what I'm working with here up close. And then the other advantage is now I can just cut all of my knuckles. They're going to be the same length, okay, because I've got it set on my jig, all right? Lo and behold, I already have a bunch. Okay, so now all I have to do with my knuckles is, you always get that little burr that hangs off there when you cut something with a saw. So I'm just going to take my 400 sandpaper and just give the very end of this very gently, because I don't want to ruin my angle here. Just very gently, just give it a little swipe, and that's usually enough to take that little extra burr off the edge of my knuckle. Okay, so I'm going to do that with all of these. Sometimes, less is more. Don't start filing me in, because then all your knuckles are different sizes, and then you get your angle all out of whack. So just doing one little swipe on some sandpaper on a flat surface is going to maintain the shape of knuckle that you want. I have 4 here because I'm going to pass one of them around to show to you guys. Okay, so I got my, whoa, maybe not, here we go, right here. So, I've got my seat and I've got my knuckles. I have a couple of things I need to prepare before I go and solder this, okay? Because every single possible scenario for preventing, well, I'll go into all the problems that you can have when you try to solder knuckles is sometimes they like to be buddies and then they just kind of solder together, okay? Or what happens is the solder wants to flow into the edges of your knuckle and solder to the pin that you have inside, okay? You don't want that. Those are real common. Try not to melt your knuckles, they're pretty small. So what I'm going to do is to prevent anything from happening, I'm going to go over and draw again. I'm going to take a little edge. In fact, I'll do it for, okay, I'll do it, I'll draw. This is my hinge looking from the side, okay? I've got my 3 knuckles here. I'm going to take a little edge off my knuckle on the surface that's going to be sitting down. So what it creates is a stop on the edge of my knuckle. So when my solder is flowing along, it has a spot to stop instead of keep going on to its buddy right next door. Okay? If you don't, yeah, so let me just show you what I mean. I'm going to take just a flat needle file here. And I'm literally just going to give it right on the edge a little swipe. One little tiny swipe. And this is what I'm going to pass around because there's no way in the world you'll be able to see this. So one little swipe takes a little edge off of that knuckle. That's the part that's going to sit down and it'll create a little stop so my solder has a spot to stop. Okay? So let me go ahead and pass this around. Today I got smart. I made extra knuckles, so I don't need that one back to solder this. Now on my end ones, I don't actually want to show a little piece taken off on my end, so I'm going to leave those flat. So I'm only doing this little notch on the spots where it is butt up against another knuckle. Okay. The trick is to those inner ones. If I've taken, I love this soldering pick, I've been pointing and everything with this. If I've taken a little edge off here, I have to make sure that I take my edge off in the exact same parallel spot on the other end for my middle knuckle. You don't want it to, you don't want your tubing to be sitting here and you have your little notch here and then it's down over here, because when it's sitting flat, your notches are not doing anything for you, okay? So you just have to be really careful. It's even hard to make a score line. You can, if you would like, and in fact what I would recommend, if you really don't think you can judge this correctly, I would make a score line on your tubing before you ever start cutting it. It's easier to make a score mark down the middle of your tubing before you cut and do it on a longer piece than trying to do it on this little tiny knuckle. Okay? So I'm doing my middle piece here. That's pretty good. So this is just one of my precautions that I take for soldering my knuckles together. Okay. Questions about the knuckles?
So when you're laying the knuckles down, you can visibly see the notches?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'll show you. Once I do this and get it set up, you'll be able to see them. They seem pretty small passing it around, but believe me, that little bit makes a big difference, okay? think I'll clean these. So I'll show you my little sludge recipe I use for cleaning metal. Everybody has a different recipe that they use. So I'm going to go ahead and clean all this stuff up. What I like to do is, let me know if you can't see. I take some pumice. You don't have, which you can get at any hardware store, but if you don't have pumice laying around, I use baking soda, just as a tiny abrasive. Okay. A little bit of water, a little bit of soap. I'm going to get my little smudge here. So I have a nice little abrasive, clean mixture here that I use for cleaning. Ammonia never has worked for me.
Do you ever use just Ajax?
No. Actually, that probably wouldn't be so
If you
bad.
can't find pumice.
Yeah. Baking soda works almost as well as the pumice. Just, neutralize anything that's on there. And it does have a slight abrasive to it. Now I'm not going to scrub my little knuckles because I'll probably lose them. So I'm just going to, I've got the stuff on my hands, I'm just going to clean it a little bit, rub them. And then always dry your piece of metal before you solder. Take the towel here. Because otherwise it mixes with your flux. You got watery flux and you get bubbling and all kinds of stuff that you don't want. For anybody that's inexperienced jeweler, you've realized that you don't really have to clean the stuff beforehand. You just kind of start soldering. I think after you do a certain amount of time and have a couple of problems, I probably shouldn't tell you that. If you're doing copper, you always have to sand off that oily finish that you get from copper. Things will not solder to copper if you don't sand off that oily surface that's on there. I've had so many students trying to do that, and I'm like, well, you need to get that off of there. So I'm going to pick the flattest spot on my soldering pad, and preferably you want to use like a brand new one if you're doing something like this. This corner seems to be working okay for me. I just have to remember which knuckles are my end pieces. Okay. That's my center one, that's my end. Okay. Another precaution, I forgot to get it out here. I'm going to go ahead and on the very edge of my knuckle where it's going to be touching its buddy, I'm going to do a little circle of Sharpie on there. Just as another little tiny precaution for that, to prevent that solder from seeping in between those knuckles, okay? I'm sorry, what?
Sharpies or
Yeah, I'm not a fan of whiteout. First of all, it's water soluble and it gets all over the place. I might not be careful enough and I end up with whiteout all over the place. And then the other problem that I have with it is I've had it mix with my seam, my solder seam, where then I suddenly have little pits in my solder seam. So that's another reason why I don't use whiteout.
Where do you put that now? Where do you not make it very, can you zoom up on that?
Want to do a couple there?
Just see how I did that on the edge there? Can you guys see that? I'm sorry, I gotta remember that
Maybe you
there's
could
this
draw it on the
video.
board too.
I'll draw it there. We had trouble with this one yesterday. So I'm gonna go ahead and just swipe the edge, circle of my
Yeah, where
tubing.
it fits with the focus.
Can you see it? I'll draw it on the board for you. You guys see that? the edge of my, this is my tubing. My knuckle. I went ahead and put magic marker on that surface right there. Okay? Just as another little precaution that I could possibly take. And also, you know, be really patient and take your time setting it up. In fact, do that with every single time you sit down to solder. It works much better to just really take your time and set up. You end up saving yourself time. I've already mixed up my flux, how I want it. I like it a little more watery when I'm doing a hinge, only because if I have it too thick, what starts happening is I get my little knuckles start moving first of all, and then if I have too much flux, I can't see what's going on. Okay, so I tend to do my flux a little more toward the soft ice cream, melting ice cream consistency. Okay, so let me go ahead and.
What kind of flux are you using?
I'm using paste flux. It's what is it? It's just Griff flux. Okay.
It's just basic flux.
Yeah. Now, when I set this up, I am going to, let's see if I can get the right thing. I'm going to use a T-pin. It just so happens I got the tubing that fits this T-pin just perfectly. I did that on purpose. And I'm going to thread my knuckles right onto this T-pin, okay? The reason why I'm using, first of all, I want a steel center, less of a chance of your soldering seeping in and soldering to your inner pin, okay? You want something tight. So when I put this on here, I should be able to flip this down and not have this tubing drop off. That's how tight you want it. So I slip this on here. It's tight enough that it's not going to slip off. Okay. It's dirty. I made it dirty. Okay, and you want it to be dirty. If you've used a brand new T-pin, which you can get in like any, I think you can even get them at the grocery store, or you know, fabric store. If you get a brand new one, I like to put a little bit of oil on the surface of my pin to make it dirtier, so my solder doesn't want to seep in and solder to it. Okay. Another good thing to use is old dull drill bit. A drill bit. Yeah. You can get the exact size for the interior of your tubing, and it's straight and steel and usually dirty. I've had people say in some books they recommend using like broken up drill or saw blades. I would not recommend those. First of all, you know those little teeth, they love getting stuck in there and you can't get that thing out. And then secondly, you end up making the inside, by taking those in and out, you end up making the inside of your tubing bigger. Okay? So that's why I wouldn't use those. Okay, so I thread these guys all on, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up all of my little boy, this is going to be hard to see. I'm lining up all of my little parts that I don't like the way that one's lined up. All my little notches, okay? So you can see I have a notch here. Well, maybe you can. It's really tiny, okay? But take my word for it, there's a little notch there, and then there's a little notched area here, okay?
We see it.
Can you see it good? Then I'm going to go and take not a whole lot of flux, because I don't want all this bubbling up all over the place, but I'm going to go ahead and flux this. See, I have it lined up, and then I'm just going to turn this over. Now remember, it's on here nice and tight, so I can move this around and not have my knuckles moving all over the place. And I'm going to go ahead and sit this down. See, I have my knuckles are overhanging a little bit. That's okay. But you know what? I don't like my pin that I chose. Looks like it's bent a little. So this is what I mean by making sure you have everything perfect. So I'm going to go ahead and take these off and do it again.
Now, are
Okay.
you putting the notches up?
The notches are down.
They're down.
Yeah. Maybe I can try to unbend my... Instead of taking this off, I think I didn't notice that I had picked a pin that was bent. So you gotta be careful not to pick a pin that's bent. Okay, that's pretty good. Make sure, one thing that happens sometimes when you go to put your knuckles down, your sheet separates. Make sure your sheet underneath there is touching. So you don't run the risk of having your sheet underneath split apart. Okay, you don't want it to split apart because you want it to be even. You could if you want to. Yeah. Pin it in place. You could.
Now, did you fix the whole thing?
I did. Yeah. Because I'm going to solder this all at once. Okay.
Can you run a Sharpie down the butted edge?
You could. Yeah, you could. That is another thing that can happen. Good point. Is that all of a sudden your sheet, where it's touching underneath, that solders together. Okay. So what he suggested is running a Sharpie down that edge. Okay, you can do that. If I were doing something thicker, I would definitely do that. If I were soldering it where I actually am soldering my hinge and my sheets are closed, I'd actually stick a piece of paper in there. Okay? And what I mean is right here, if I'm soldering something where I have two thick pieces together, I would literally, before I close that up, I would stick a little piece of paper in there to prevent those guys from soldering together. Okay? You know what? I don't like this pin. I'm sorry. I'd rather it work. So,
Marcia, on the back side of the pin, you've got the T-bar.
yeah.
Doesn't, Marcia was saying it also, does it weight it, or do you put something underneath it so that it makes it?
I could. You know what? If I had bigger tubing or a different scenario, would definitely weight it. This one, it's just bent. So that's what I've got going here.
So it doesn't make it uneven on a small piece of paper?
No, Actually, maybe what I will do is, maybe I'm, no, see, that's not making it any better. All right. If I were at home, I would go ahead and change this. I'm going to change it. Like I said, got to take your time, set it up right, or something could go wrong. Okay.
Marcia, do you ever file the solder edge of your knuckle just to make it rougher so it solders better?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Do you ever file the solder edge of your knuckle just so that it attaches better to the sheet?
No, I don't. No. Okay, I've got this all lined up. I got it relined up here. Okay. That's much better. Okay, we are ready. So, what I'm going to do is when I solder, this is sort of my version of how I solder, and Andy later is going to be demonstrating soldering. You can ask him other questions, and he might do it differently. I don't know if he does. I like to add solder to my piece after it's warmed, okay, using a soldering pick. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add a piece right here and here. I'm putting my solder in the center of my knuckle, okay? The reason for that is because when my solder flows, if I have it off to one side, it can go and solder to its little friend sitting right next to it. And if you have it in the center, you run less risk of having your solder flow onto the next knuckle.
Where do you have the notches? Are they straight up
They're down. They're down on the sheet.
inside?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Can you see them on the side so you know they're lined up, or is that?
What I did is when I didn't put them on my T-pin, I had them all lined up, and then I just flipped my T-pin over and set it down. Okay? It's a good question. Looks pretty good. All right. Cutting my solder. I am going to cut the tiniest little pieces of solder you've ever seen, okay? I like to use sheet because then I can cut more pieces and I can cut them smaller and I can cut them faster. And I always cut way more solder than I think I'm going to need. And what I'm doing is I'm cutting fringe, okay? Little tiny fringe with some cutters. The trick to not having them fly all over the place, I cut fringe long enough that I hold the edge of the fringe up against my finger, okay? Take my cutters, back cutting my skin on my finger. Then I have all my little pieces just sitting there right on my finger, okay?
Is that medium?
I think so. I just grabbed it. If I were doing a hinge, it would probably be one of the last steps that I'm doing, and I probably would be soldering my hinge with easy, okay? I literally just grabbed this. I have no idea what it is. These pieces look too big to me, so I'm gonna cut more. Ah, those are better. Okay. Like I said, I always cut way more than I need. I'm going to spread these guys out so I can see which ones are the smallest. I'm going to pick out these smallest pieces. Okay. What torch to use today? I'll do this guy. I'm going to see if it's on.
You're using a settler?
I am. At home I use a mini torch. This particular mini torch is temperamental, so. There was definitely a guy working at this last. Andy goes last, right?
Right.
Couldn't get that bench pin off, and now I can't.
You want me to
get
help
this.
you?
Yeah.